amazing lineup as always, and we're very fortunate to have Charlotte Canteloup speak to us today about social networks and social learning in wild vervet monkeys. So just to give a very brief introduction, Charlotte is a researcher at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and throughout her career she's had an interest in primate social cognition, and for a PhD she worked on theory of mind and the evolution of cognition. So for her postdoc, she worked with the University of Zurich and Lausanne in Switzerland on the origins of culture and social transmission in vervet monkeys. And so she now works as part of Erica van der Waals group, working on social learning strategies in vervet monkeys as part of the Inkawu Vervet project in South Africa, which we hope to hear a little bit more today. And so many of you will know that sort of our lab has a focus on African primates and culture and social learning. So we're really excited to have her here today. So I'd like to extend a warm virtual welcome on behalf of our lab and to everyone watching. And just a reminder that if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to add them in the comments in the live feed. And hopefully we will try do our best to get through as many as we can. But without further ado, I'd like to thank Charlotte again, and I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for this introduction and for inviting me today to present you my work. So I'm very pleased to speak today about social network and social learning in vervet monkeys. So social species are organized in social network that consist of nodes connected by edges. And so each node represents individuals. And edges represent either association, so for example, spatial proximity, or interactions as agonistic interactions or affiliative interactions. But edges can also represent observation between nodes. And so in a network, some individuals are more central than others, and they occupy key network positions. So either because they are connected to many different social partners, or because they frequently interact with some of these partners, or because they are connected to highly connected individuals. And so it has been shown that central individuals are more likely to learn novel information from their conspecific than less or non-central individuals. And so network position can affect information transmission by influencing who learns from whom. And also, so with some individuals being more likely to transmit information than others. So social network analysis appears thus to be a really powerful tool to quantify social connections and to assess social transmission. And I will today focus my talk about information social transmission. So basically what I studied during my postdoc, and which occur via social learning. So social learning has been defined as learning facilitated by observation of or interaction with another individual or its products. And while individual learning represents learning for oneself through experience and or trial and error. And so both kinds of learning have costs and benefits. For example, social learning can be a more rapid and efficient way to acquire information, but it doesn't guarantee success because sometimes social information can be maladaptive or outdated. And conversely, individual learning can be trustworthy because the individual collected the information by himself, and but it's also more time-consuming. So theoretical models predict that social learning shouldn't be used in an indiscriminate manner but should be selective and driven by what some scholars have called social learning strategies or social learning biases. And I will use the term biases to refer to this strategy. So these social learning biases represent flexible rules that specify or bias when, how, and from whom individuals should use social information under suitable circumstances. And these biases, which are not necessarily conscious and for which several kinds of biases may be at stake simultaneously, are important because they can generate traditions, behavioral traditions, and culture. So these different biases can be of different kinds. So content biases focus on the content of the behavior. So for example, individuals may adopt preferentially the behavior with higher payoff, for example. Or context and context biases split into frequency-dependent biases and individual-based biases. So for frequency-dependent biases, rare behaviors or the most frequent behavior or the behavior demonstrated by the more individuals, which is also called conformity, may be adopted. But some specific individuals, so for example, individuals may preferentially learn from individuals from the same family, or from older individuals, or from individuals of the same sex, or higher ranker, for example. And all these different, or several of these different biases have been found to be quite widespread within the animal kingdom. And some of these biases, so hook biases, have been investigated in wild vervet monkeys using different kinds of field experiments. And so vervet monkeys have been found to be to preferentially adopt the behavior of high-ranking females compared to high-ranking males in a two-action task. Using this kind of box that you can see as a picture. Males adopt males' behavior when the male received a higher payoff compared to females. And in another study, immigrant males have been found to conform to the majority, to the new group habit. However, those studies focused on the acquisition of a new behavior, and they also have mainly tested different biases separately. So we don't precisely know whether several kinds of biases may be at stake simultaneously, and also what is actually the weight of each strategy in the acquisition, but also in the subsequent use of the behavior. So I conducted 2 experiments to test whether new foraging techniques spread socially in vervet monkeys. And so these experiments involve 2 new foraging techniques. So the first experiment was this box. So use this box that you can see here, two-action design, containing a food reward that we also called artificial fruit. And in the second experiment, I provided monkeys with a novel unknown food. So it was unshelled peanuts that they needed to process before consuming them. So it means that in the box experiment, we studied the acquisition of box opening techniques. So we asked whether monkeys socially learn how to open the box for the first time, and if yes, from whom did they learn? So we really focused here on the first learning event. While in the peanuts experiment, we were rather interested in what happened after individual had learned how to extract peanuts from their shell. So we really focused instead on the production or the maintenance for preference of the peanuts processing technique. And so we basically investigated which social learning biases were at play during the acquisition of boxes opening technique and during the production of peanuts processing technique. So we tested for content biases and frequency dependent biases in the peanuts experiment, and for the individual based biases for both experiments, so the peanuts and the box experiments. So I conducted these experiments within the Incavu Vervet project, which is directed by Erika van de Waal, and that takes place in a private game reserve in South Africa. And so we studied several groups of vervet monkeys there, and vervet monkeys have live in multi-male, multi-female social groups. They have many opportunities of learn from various conspecific. And in this species, females remain in their group all their life, while males disperse to multiple groups several times in their life. And they are also non-endangered, so it means that it's really convenient to do some field experiment involving food. And so I conducted these two experiments in two groups called Noah and Kubu, so composed by between 12 and 34 individuals. So for the first experiment, I used this box that could be opened in two different ways to gain access to a small piece of apple. So either by lifting the lid on the top of the box or pulling a drawer. And so this experiment was an open diffusion experiment. So contrary to previous studies on vervet monkeys, I didn't train any demonstrator. So I just provided monkeys with 8 of these boxes that could be opened into 2 different ways at 2 different locations. So just to prevent monopolization of a single box by 1 or 2 dominant individuals. And so subjects were free to interact with the boxes, and I did so 17 experiments in Noah, 12 in Kubu, and we also video recorded these experiments. So here you can see the 2 techniques that could be used, so the lift technique on the left and the pull technique on the right. And I'm going to show you now a short video clip of the experiment. So with this individual, which is an adult female on the left using the pull technique, and on the right, there is a sub-adult male using the lift technique. So I collaborated with Will Hoppit to use a model fitting approach called network-based diffusion analysis to analyze the data of this experiment. And we used a version of NBDA called Order of Acquisition Diffusion Analysis. So this OADA takes into account the order of acquisition of the box opening technique. So it really focuses on the first learning event for each individual. And so the underlying hypothesis is that the rate of social transmission between individuals is proportional to the network connection between them. meaning that the more individuals are observing each other, the more they have learning opportunities from each other. And NBDA basically aims to answer two questions. First, is social transmission occurring? And second, if yes, which are the typical pathways of social transmission? And so we extracted a dynamic observation network from the video records. And so each time one individual was opening a box, we recorded who was attending. So we basically know who observed whom doing what. And so this figure illustrates how dynamic networks work. So for example, individual A is the first individual learning the task, and he's observed 3 times by individual B. And B learns second the behavior. And then C observes 4 times individual A and then learns the task. So NBDA using a dynamic network will model that B is more likely to learn the behavior second, and then C learns the behavior. While if we use a static network, which has been used mainly in the past, a static network would summarize all the information and would expect individual C to learn before individual B, because the strength of connection between A and C is stronger than the connection between A and B. So this is why it's really interesting to use a dynamic observation network. And in NBDA, we included multiple networks to test whether individuals socially learn from females or from males, from older individuals, and so on. And so this allowed us to assess the weight of each transmission in a single analysis. So here is a graphical representation of transmission pathway and observation patterns in both groups. And each node represents one individual. And so red names are the individual who first learned the lift technique. In yellow, they first learned the pull technique. And in black, they never learned the task. And darker is a node higher ranker is the individual. And ages between individuals represent the rate of observation between individuals. And so in NOHA, the first individual who succeeded the task was the alpha female using the lift technique, while in Kubu it was the alpha male using the pull technique. And you can see that the behavior spread to 10 individuals in Kubu and to 19 individuals over 28 in NOAA. So the first aim of NBDA was to detect and quantify social transmission. So we aim to answer, do we observe social transmission? And so for this, we built models to test whether the dynamic observation network predicted the order of acquisition of the box opening technique. And we compare these models to an asocial model where learning was random. And so we found that the model that fitted better to our data was one with social transmission, what we called option-specific effect, meaning that observing the lift technique makes you more likely to first learn the lift technique, and conversely. And so So this was for the first aim. And then the second aim of NBDA was to answer the question, which is the typical pathway of social transmission? And so, as I told you, we inputted multiple networks in the models to test for different pathway and to assess the weight of each strategy. So learning from higher ranker, learning from older individual, learning from females, and so on. And so we fitted models for different pathways in which the rate of transmission differ between different classes of individuals. So here, for example, this is the rank pathway example. And so the transmission rate differ between higher ranker and lower ranker. And we found evidence that the transmission occurred from higher ranker to lower ranker, which is consistent with learn from higher ranker strategy. And you can see here that we found no strong evidence for other kind of biases based on the sex, on the kin, or the age. So to conclude on this experiment, we have shown that vervet monkeys socially learn how to open this box, and that their learning was biased towards higher ranker. So with the observation, one observation of a higher ranker having more weight than one observation of a lower ranker. And so this result adds to previous finding and suggests that among different cues, social rank might be one of the most important one for vervet monkeys when they learn a new behavior. And this is the great advantage of NBDA, is to compare and assess different and assess the weight of different biases in a single analysis, so really simultaneously, which was not possible in previous studies. And so the second open diffusion I conducted consisted in providing monkeys with containers of this kind filled with unshelled peanuts. And one thing to know is that monkeys, being neophobic, they don't spontaneously eat noble food as peanuts, even if it seems surprising. So they really need to learn that something good to eat. And so we basically offer these containers filled with unshelled peanuts. We did it 11 times in NOAA, 10 times in Kubu. And so I've been helped by my field assistant, Mabia Serra. We video recorded this experiment, and we noticed that monkeys used 3 different techniques to extract peanuts from their shell. And I'm going to show you what were these techniques. So the first technique was crack with hand. So the monkey basically cracks the peanuts with its hand. Then the second method was to crack with the mouth, but from the top of the peanut. And the third one was to crack with the mouth, but from the side of the peanut. And I also have short video clips to show you the different technique. So here is crack with hand technique. Here is the crack with the mouth from the side of the peanut, from the top of the peanut, sorry. And here is a crack with the mouth from the side of the peanut. So you can see that they are quite different and easy to distinguish. So I collaborated with Brendan Barrett, who is a specialist of Bayesian statistics to analyze this data. And so we use a modeling fitting approach called experience-weighted attraction models to analyze our data. And so compared to NBDA, this modeling approach analyzes the whole behavioral sequence for each individual. So not only the initial spread, but really what happened from the first behavior to the last one. And so the aim was to test whether and how Peanut's opening technique socially spread once the technique was learned. And so in the algorithm, the probability of choosing a technique depends on recent and past personal experience. If a technique was successful or not, and social information associated with the technique. So the frequency of technique in a group, the observed probability of success of technique in a group, and also cues of demonstrator, so the rank, sex, and kin of individual demonstrating the technique. And so this probability was updated every 20 minutes based on the most recently experienced payoff. So that is to say how technique was successful, and also the memory of previous experiences. So just to illustrate it, you can imagine a three-sided die, and each side corresponds to one of the three techniques that a monkey will display. And the probability of choosing a technique, it's like we roll a die, and it's dynamic, and it changes as a function of the social information the individual had observed, and also his recent and past personal experiences. So we basically fitted 8 different models. It's like we rolled 8 different dices to see which one best predicted the time series of individuals' behavior. And so each model integrates individual learning. So this is the individual experience and one social learning strategy. So one model corresponds to the payoff bias, one to the rank bias, one to the frequency dependent bias, one to the kin bias, one to the same-sex bias, one to the female bias, and one model is only individual learning, so it's asocial learning. And we also fitted a global model, which includes individual learning with all other kind of biases. So in NOAA, the first individual who succeeded to open Peanuts used the crack with hand technique at the first exposure. While in Kubu it was an infant, we used the crack with the mouse from the side technique, but only at the third exposure. And at the end of the whole experiment, there were 25 individuals over 34 in NOAA who succeeded to open Peanuts at least once. And you have here the different percentage of technique used. So with 78% of success for the crack with mouse from the side technique, and so on. And in Kubu, there were fewer, so only 9 individuals over 19. So on this figure, you can see the predictions of the global model. So the model including all kinds of biases with individual learning for the group NOAA. And each, so the point size scales the average daily probability of individual displaying one technique, depending on its own behavior, its own experience, and the observation of others. So for example, here, Evan was the first individual succeeding in NOAA, in opening peanuts. And so you can notice here that he had equal probabilities to use each technique at the first experiment because he didn't observe anyone. So there is, so he had equal probabilities, and there is no more probabilities for him on the next days because he left the group after the first experiment. So he was not there anymore. And another example, for example, so Canada, here, she had a greater probability here to use the purple technique, so it's a crack with mouse from the side technique, probably because she observed more this technique being used, or also because she had more experience using this technique. So this global model predicted that the crack with the mouse from the side technique, so displayed here in purple, will be the technique most used in the group. And this is actually what we observed. So we use multi-modal inference which consists in ranking the different models that we fitted instead of selecting a single best model. And we found that the global model was the one with the lowest WAIC, which means that this one does the best job in predicting behavior of individuals in the group, in the population. And this result means, so because the global model includes individual learning with all different kinds of biases, this means that individuals differ in their use of biases, and that they combine individual learning with social learning, or they don't use all the same kind of biases. And we can see here that payoff biases and rank biases were the two other best ranked models, meaning that they are the two most important types of social learning in predicting behavior. And so just to remind you that payoff, we define the payoff as a mean observed probability of a technique being successful in the previous 20 minutes. So the more an individual observed a successful technique, the more he had a chance to consequently use it. And you can notice that the individual learning, so the last model here, was the worst in predicting the data. So this results show that payoff-based and rank-based social learning are responsible for the development of a preference for peanuts opening technique. So we found that a combination of biases coupled with individual learning were at stake in the establishment, the maintenance of behavioral preferences, as it has been reported in other species as capuchins and gray tits. So this means that even for a relatively simple behavior has peanuts processing technique, the choice of a technique is socially driven and rely on payoff and rank bias learning and not only on individual learning. And I think this is really important because it means that social learning is not only important to learn a new behavior, to acquire a new behavior, but also to maintain behavioral preference, and even those which are not necessarily complex. And so in the literature about social learning is usually interchangeably used to refer to transmission of new behavior and production of behavior. And so this distinction between social learning during acquisition and during production is important and should be treated as different in social learning research, as recently suggested by Michael Cimento and collaborator. So just before finishing my talk, I wanted to show you, to introduce the current project I'm working on, which also links social network to social learning. But here we'll study something a bit different because we'll test whether monkeys can learn from a non-living entity as a robot. And so this project involves our team in Lausanne and the robotic system lab in Zurich. And it's also funded by collaborative Bronco Waves Fellowship. So yeah, this project aims at investigating the social integration of this four-legged robot that you can see here on this picture, and the final aim being to test later whether monkeys can bond with a robot, or if they can learn from a robot, if they can trust knowledge from a robot. But this will happen later, at a later stage of the project. So this robot is remotely controlled. It has an open box, wooden box that you can see here on its back, that we can fill it with food. And so for now, we just ran a very pilot study where we brought this robot to the field for about 10 hours over a week. And so we introduced the robot following different steps. So the first step, the robot was laying down on the ground, as you can see on this picture. And we put the food on the box that we put on the ground, and also food around the robot on the ground, just to attract monkeys. And then in a second step, the robot was stably standing on the ground, standing up, quadruped, and surrounded by food on the ground as well. In a third step, the robot was slightly moving its body, standing up with no food on the ground anymore, but only on the box, inside the box. And in a fourth step, the robot was slightly moving its head, that you can see here, and no food on the ground anymore. So we only put food on inside the box. So we also video recorded these sessions, and I can show you how it was. So we recorded the behavior of individuals, the reaction of monkeys like this one, head bobbing towards the robot. And we also recorded who was in spatial proximity of the robot to construct some proximity network. So here is a network depicting who was around the robot within arm length distance, so really close proximity network. So each node represents also individuals. Adults are in names of adults are written in red. In orange, it's juveniles, and infants in yellow. Darker is a node, higher ranker is individuals. And the ages between individuals represent the strengths of proximity within arm length distance. And you have 3 letters which call for males and 4 letters for females. And so what you can notice here is that all these individuals are from the G family. So it's the same matrilines, and they are the highest rank matriline of the group. And so this was on the day 1, first step. And you can notice that the network, this spatial proximity network, is basically the same on the day after. So no more individuals came within arm length distance of the robot, but just that the strength of connection is a bit stronger. And here are the 5-meter proximity network on day 1 and day 2. And you can notice that way more individuals spend time within 5 meters to the robot, and that this number increased from day 1 to day 2. And not only high ranker individuals, but also lower ranker spend time within 5 meters of the robot. So this is really a very preliminary investigation of social acceptance of a robot by monkeys. But stay tuned if you want to hear more about that project in the coming months. So thank you very much for your attention. I want also to thank my collaborators, my funders, and also all the people who helped me in the field for data collection. And I'm happy to listen to your questions now.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that brilliant talk. I think it is brilliant that you're synthesizing so many interesting strands of research, from field work to field experiments and novel statistical techniques for measuring culture. And I know that the field has been slow to adopt some of these sort of innovative techniques. So it's really exciting to see how important and useful it is for other researchers to hopefully apply these methods to other field sites. So we've got, I think, time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions, and we have a load of questions here. So I'm going to try not to bombard you with too many, and we can try and get through as much as we can. So let me just change my screen here. Okay, brilliant. So we had a few questions about sort of the interesting experimental paradigms with the artificial boxes. And so like one of the questions we had from the audience was, how do you, I think it's sort of a simple one, but how do you assess rank when you're trying to examine these biases?
So we assess rank outside of this experiment. So in parallel to this experiment, because you Usually when we are in the field, we run experiments no more than 2 days a week. Yeah. And the remaining days are dedicated to data collection in the field. And on a normal day of data collection, we record agonistic behaviors that occur ad libitum, and or that might also occur around experiments. And so we have some rules of winner and losers, and then we can have some matrices of agonistic behavior. And then we use one method. So we can use different methods. There is the ELO rating for the rank. But me, I use the I and SI method from De Vries, and which basically gives the same kind of ranks for the hierarchy.
So it sounds like you've got quite a dynamic way of measuring how that changes over time. So we have a sort of slightly related question, but I think you mentioned that the boxes are poorly suited for testing the frequency-based hypotheses was compared to the peanuts. Does that make sense? Was there a reason why that was?
So for the box experiment, we didn't study the frequency biases, because we could only test for model-based biases. So did they learn from specific individuals? And for the frequency-based biases, we study that only for the peanuts experiment.
Okay. So I think slightly related, but more on the construction of the social network. So like a big problem in the field is which do you use? The construction of the social network could be influencing the results, and are you going to use association-based or interaction-based? So did you sort of explore that a little bit, and did you find that there was some networks that were more robust for looking at these diffusion experiments?
So here we really constructed observation networks. So I think that's something that is really important in our experiment, is that we recorded direct observation. So we precisely know which individual observed whom doing what. So it means that we didn't use, for example, association proximity network as a proxy for observation, or interaction as a proxy for observation. We really directly collected this observation network during the experiments. So I think that the more precise and the more detailed network we can have access.
I think it's really nice that you can have that with that. To see that directional aspect. It's really exciting. I can imagine it was quite time consuming for trying to code all that information. From video footage, I'm guessing as well, you had to do some,
And also in the field, it was a bit tricky because we needed to be at least between 2 and 4 individuals at the same time in the field during the experiment to record, who is manipulating the box and who is observing this individual, and to speak and say the log to the camera what was happening online at the same time.
Hectic video. We've all been there. So we have a range of other topics that I think we've got time to cover. So we have some questions about bias, some questions about individual variation and personality, a few on cultural evolution, and sort of on interesting, exciting future directions. So maybe I can just choose one of the bias ones. So did you consider testing the presence of familiarity bias? If so, do you expect to find a decreasing degree of trustworthiness between kins and friends and acquaintances, even strangers? Does that make sense?
So familiarity bias, you mean individual who would be more familiar to?
Yeah, I'm assuming either to the actual sort of experimental paradigm, and then whether that sort of familiarity to the experimental paradigm was influenced in the networks. I think I'm trying to read that question properly, but yeah.
Okay, no, I think I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Because in the two experiments, we did one box experiment using some artificial fruits, and even though these boxes were new to the monkeys because we never used these boxes before, they had experience with other kinds of experiments using boxes before, while with the peanuts experiment, it was something completely new. Because we used a novel unknown food that they never encountered before. So I think, that would make sense to hypothesize that maybe biases could be different according to the level of novelty of the task. But we found a rank bias in both experiments. So it seemed that the rank or learning from higher ranker seemed something important for vervet monkeys to learn. Something new, something maybe really new as a novel food as peanuts, and something maybe a bit less new as boxes.
So maybe overriding some other aspects of personal relationships with the rest of the group. And we've got a slightly different question. How do you think environmental stress could impact the findings? So do you think that stressful environments, so I guess this is moving more into ecology, could favor certain biases? Like, for example, food, water availability, or depending on seasonality? Was this something that maybe you just haven't incorporated yet into your sort of these fine scale ecological aspects?
I don't know. That's not something that we investigated for sure. But I think, it might have an influence. Depending on. I think the situation and the environment could have an impact or an influence on this. And this is something that should be tested or simulated as a next step or investigation.
I assume that if you have amazing sort of rich video data, that this is a question that someone could investigate at some point, especially if you have interesting developmental aspects. I know some people in our lab are interested in that as well. But moving on to sort of personality, I guess we've touched on it a little bit perhaps, but so do you think, did you see a really strong variation in terms of individual personality for the experiment? So we have a question here. Do you think boldness, depending on how we measure that, makes individuals more likely to learn by trial and error without spending large amounts of time observing?
Yes, that's a good question. So that's not something that I investigated in my studies. I didn't run any personality test or this kind of stuff, but I think that's something really, really interesting to do. And but what I noticed in this experiment is that the innovators, or so the individual who first acquires the behavior, first succeed at the task, were not the same in the two experiments, because in the box experiment they were really high rankers individuals, while in the peanuts experiment they were rather low or mid-rank individuals. And what was interesting also in the peanuts experiment was that in the group where the innovator was a low ranker individuals, higher ranker didn't really pay much attention to what these lower ranker individuals were doing.
That's really, so that you saw quite a lot of variation in terms of innovation between the groups, and actually that fits in quite well, thinking about demographics and life history and these sort of larger scale processes, which I'm guessing haven't incorporated as of yet. But is this something that you would like to examine, because you have this amazing opportunity to look at cross communities sort of comparisons between groups of vervet monkeys, and maybe you can incorporate some of these other aspects?
Yeah, I think it's probably really linked to to the kind of experiment we do, and yeah, I could only test two groups because it was already a lot of work, but I'm sure it would be really interesting to do more experiments and different kinds of experiments in more groups to investigate more this question.
And I'm assuming that this is like with a lot of field sites, that as this data accumulates, there's going to be more potential to look at long-term patterns, which is really exciting. And yeah, definitely I think your work is amazing in showing that, with these new statistical techniques, we can map this spread, and we can also now look at the detailed dynamic sort of behavioral profile, like you were talking about, with these dynamic networks, which is really exciting. But I had a sort of question related to, a key aspect of social learning and cultural evolution is the innovation and modification of traits. And I know this is like down the line, because you have to tackle one of these things at a time. But sort of, were you able to document variation in foraging techniques, and that you saw these three basic in the open diffusion experiment foraging techniques? Do you think that there is potential for these traits to be modified, or did you see anything where they were modified over time?
So we described these three different kinds of technique, and we also observed that I remember that some individuals were using some technique, and also they were also rubbing the peanuts before processing it, for example, and that's something that few individuals also adopted, but there were not only many individuals doing that. So I think it's the sample size was not big enough.
So you weren't able to statistically quantify whether that was socially learned, that sort of slight modification.
So that's something that we observed, and then we didn't observe any other kind of modification or I don't know, with technique that would become more and more complex. But we also did this experiment over 3 or 4 months, only about 10 experiments, so it's probably not enough to...
Maybe in 30 years' time, you can analyze the data.
Maybe.
So yeah, I'm assuming it's a related question, but you didn't see any individuals combine behaviors with any of the processing, or I guess a side shoot is you didn't see one individual try a technique and then use another, in that they shifted their technique, they had sort of flexibility. That was possible. So they had, for most of them, one preferred technique, but it doesn't mean that they didn't use other technique after that, or that they completely stick to one technique. This is not what we observed. Right, interesting. So I'm just going to try and see. I think we have time to sort of wrap up with a couple of questions. There's another question here. So in sort of your research and more generally in the field of social learning and sort of culture, what sort of it might be methodological or sort of theoretical breakthrough excites you the most, And what do you think is one of the biggest challenges for you as a researcher exploring that next? That's sorry, it's a bit of a tough question.
So I think studying this social learning biases is interesting and important to understand why, for example, in some populations, some specific behavior or traditions can arise and not in others. And vervet monkeys are not very known or for having some behavioral traditions, and this could maybe be explained by this strong rank-based social learning, because and the peanuts experiment is an example. If some low rankers innovate new behaviors, but that no one is paying attention to what they do because they are not of high rank, this can, of course, make the behavior disappearing and explain why we don't observe many more social traditions in vervet monkeys. So I think, yeah, this is how I link these results to the more global picture.
Right.
And then,
sorry, continue.
Yeah, for the challenge, yeah, I think it's really difficult to find a good setup and good experiment to test animals, and to keep in mind that we should always find something that makes sense for them.
Right. And you saw some, I mean, we saw some really interesting future directions on the technological front, which is mind-blowing to me that the field is sort of changing in this direction. So there's actually a question that's just come in around that sort of interesting future direction, about, so we've got a question here, was the robot perceived as a risk by the vervets? Like, could the robot in itself be quite sort of disruptive or change the actual social dynamics that you're observing?
So that's a question, an open question. I was quite surprised because I at the start of this experiment, I thought that they would really freak out when they would see this robot and run away and disappear in the bush. But this is not really what happened, because from the first day they came around the robot. They were not so afraid, so impressed by this huge and noisy robot. So this is really surprising. So yeah, I don't know. I guess with time, if we repeat the experiment and this robot comes almost every day or every week in the field, in their natural environment, I think this is completely something that they could consider as I mean,
I guess especially if you have some groups that aren't using this robot, you could see if it's impactful in any way on those sort of networks. But I think we could talk about robots for ages, but I think that we have to wrap up now. So if you do have any more questions, please do get in touch with Charlotte, or drop us an email. And just a reminder that following on from Charlotte's talk next week, we have another great speaker on March the 8th at 3 p.m. with Michelle Brown, with competitive dynamics in a frugivore guild. And you can check all the Twitter updates for that. But otherwise, I'm just going to wrap up and say thank you so much, Charlotte, for a really, really interesting talk. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone watching has done as well. So thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye. Perfect.